Okay, so the question, who was worse, Woodrow Wilson or Franklin D. Roosevelt? I made the case for Woodrow Wilson. Here's a little bit about FDR. Franklin Roosevelt was the first president that never had to work a day in his life because he was independently wealthy. Ironically, FDR, once elected as president, would immediately start a flurry of administrative activity that would punish the very private sector that made his family rich. FDR would use Wilson's progressive agenda and extrapolate from Herbert Hoover's meddling federal programs to secure a second Bill of Rights that would protect people from the unfairness and repercussions of the stock market crash of 1929. Times were tough, and FDR was a firm believer that intensive government intervention in American society would make things better. FDR's second Bill of Rights included a remunerative job, a decent home, adequate medical care, and a good education, among other things. These were things that the American public really wanted to hear at the time. The New Deal was a conglomeration of programs that would realize his vision of a second Bill of Rights. So let's start with the easy one here, the Social Security Act of 1935. This was basically pension and unemployment benefits for the average American citizen. Entitlements like this were referred to as earned benefits and were promises of guaranteed payout without a guaranteed contribution, by the way. Look at your pay stub under the deduction section. You will find a line item that says SSI. FDR sold Social Security to the American public as an insurance program. It was like an investment. You put money in the pot, and as you pay into it, your money earns interest, and then when you reach a certain age, you collect your pension. But here's the thing. The government spends that money, borrows against it. It's not in some vault somewhere. It's all a big pyramid scam to get more of your money. Anyway, underscoring FDR's devious nature for social engineering, the case for Social Security insurance was brought to the Supreme Court, arguing that there was no authority for the federal government to mandate insurance. So while FDR was selling Social Security to the public as an insurance program, at the same time, his lawyers were arguing in front of SCOTUS that Social Security was actually a tax. And with the passage of the 16th Amendment, which made the federal income tax constitutional, everything fell into place and Social Security became legal. Who do we have to thank for passing the 16th Amendment, by the way? Oh yes, Woodrow Wilson. So let's talk farm subsidies. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was a program where the federal government paid out compensation to farmers for their agricultural products. It encouraged overproduction in that the Fed set limits that were not tied to real market demand. But more importantly, this act set up the federal government to exercise a huge power grab and encroach on state and individual liberties. Wickard v. Filburn was a case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The net was that SCOTUS ruled that an individual growing crops on their own land for self-consumption, no commerce, in-state or out, was passively affecting interstate commerce by withholding their goods from the market and thus subject to federal production limits. So what's the punchline here? The federal government was exercising the authority reserved to states and individuals, a clear constitutional violation. Let's talk labor. Labor organizations were recognized at the federal level via the National Labor Relations Act, securing the right of labor unions to exist and collectively bargain. This began the meteoric rise of unions and their love affair with big government, the Democratic Party, and their contentious relationship with private sector businesses. With the National Industrial Recovery Act, a new federal body was created called the National Recovery Administration, which allowed entire industrial and trade associations to set prices, employee wages, and safety and manufacturing codes. Effectively, the government was giving the green light for collusion at an industrial sector level. This effectively reversed the entire antitrust movement and legislation that his cousin Teddy Roosevelt started decades before. So, collusion in the private sector without government intervention, bad. Collusion in the private sector with government intervention, that's okay. That makes a lot of sense. So let's talk public works. The federal government basically came up with a program to pay citizens to build things like bridges, courthouses, theaters, public schools, hospitals, roads, infrastructure stuff. Local governments didn't have the money to pay teachers, buy books, or maintain the buildings or roads. And so the feds were basically paying average American citizens to build all these things, which turned into virtual ghost towns. Since the government built the infrastructure and heavily taxed the private sector, businesses had no incentive to invest, expand, or make profits, of which could be taxed. This actually shrunk the tax base. This is the problem that you get when you start messing around with free market principles of supply and demand. The federal government spends more money, but gets less back in private sector tax revenues. Way to go. Revenue Act of 1935. This was a huge tax on the wealthy to pay for all of these New Deal federal programs. But the wealthy would only find tax shelters to avoid these heavy taxes anyway. FDR, being ever persistent, proposed a 99.5% tax rate on all incomes over $100,000. Luckily, it failed. But alas, FDR issued an executive order that all incomes over $25,000 be taxed at a 100% tax rate. 100%. Another perk from the Revenue Act? Withholding taxes from your paycheck was instituted. Yeah, FDR did that too. FDR ruled for an unprecedented 3 terms, enough to screw America up for generations to come. Result, the 20th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution limiting the president to 2 terms in office. Thank God, at least one good thing came out of all that. So I want to leave you with 2 quotes that are apropos for summing up FDR's legacy. There's a book that I really like by Mark Levin. It's called Liberty and Tyranny. And there's a really good quote on the back of the book. It says, "We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor, while with others, the same word may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor. Here are 2 not only different but incompatible things called by the same name, liberty. And it follows that each of these things is, by the respective parties, called by 2 different and incompatible names, liberty and tyranny." Abraham Lincoln, 1864. And another quote that I think sums up FDR's legacy was written by C.S. Lewis. "Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience." Clearly, one could argue that FDR's tyranny was disguised as liberty. Liberty from troubles and financial perils that were happening at the time. But we're still seeing the impacts even today. The case for FDR.